A warm welcome again to our audience that is dropping in bit by bit. It's our pleasure as KfW Stiftung, KfW Stiftung here in Frankfurt, to host this format today, which is not the first time. We have started to accompany our program in Frankfurt and Germany with more and more digital formats, as global issues should be discussed globally, and using technology enables us to include speakers, people, and interested audiences from all over this world. So good morning, good evening, good afternoon, depending on where you are in the different time zones. Maybe you also watch this later on as a recording. So that is also something to mention. This lecture today will be recorded. You can remain anonymously. Simply don't use your name when you enter a question in the chat. After the discussion, we will have a short input by Dr. Brigitte Franzen first, and then afterwards there will be room for discussion and Q&A. If you would like to participate, just drop your question or comment in the chat or in the Q&A tool, and we will make sure it's addressed. We can also unmute you so you can speak out loud. Sometimes that's a little easier. Again, if you would like to remain anonymously, please don't use your full name in the sign up. My name is Daniela Leykam. I'm responsible for the Arts and Culture funding program here at the foundation, and I've also curated the exhibition at Villa 102 together with my colleagues Rose Field and Alisa Zenger. However, it is important to know that this is not a project that stands on its own legs. It was developed as part of a much larger program in collaboration with our partner, the Akademie Schloss Solitude. And dear Elke, please wave. Warm welcome also to our partner. Elke is the director of the Akademie Schloss Solitude. Would you like to say a couple of warm welcoming words to the group?
Yes, of course. A very warm welcome from my side. I'm pretty happy that we have this chance to come together again and again with a different audience. I'm looking forward for this next step. It's one of, as Daniela Leykam said, of a larger cooperation between Akademie Schloss Solitude and the KfW Foundation in Frankfurt. And this was part of a new conceptual direction under my tenureship as a director, and it was part of the first transdisciplinary thematical focused program. And I'm pretty happy this the cohort of people, we see only 5, but we were altogether 7 artists. Daniela will say a little bit more about the structure. And we were working together for more than 9 months on this topic of mutation. And I'm pretty happy that we have now the possibility also to get an insight on the topic of artistic research by my colleague Brigitte Franzen from the Senckenberg Museum. Thank you for joining us. Thank you.
Thank you, Elke. Yes, so 7 artists from 7 different disciplines, all with a different and somewhat transdisciplinary approach to their practice in their work, came together for 9 months to work under the thematic umbrella of mutations. A lot has happened in this time, an online lecture series, which you'll find on YouTube, where you will also find this part then later on. Then there is a print publication, which is also available online. We're happy to share the links throughout. So that's also the reason why we chose this topic, as you know, it is something that kept us busy throughout the program, but also afterwards, and how disciplines can meet, how new methodologies and approaches join forces together to express something, how they might sometimes react to each other, illustrate each other, enforce each other. So this was the starting point for us to choose this topic for today. Before we go into detail with that, as some of you might have not been into Frankfurt yet or don't know the exhibition space and won't have a chance to see it, I'm going to share my screen briefly. Hopefully it works. I'm going to share my screen and show some visuals and use this also to introduce the artists who have joined us for the conversation today. And would like to ask those names who are present here today to wave to our audience the moment I show their work. So ideally, you can see my screen? Some affirmative nodding?
We can see
Yeah?
it, Daniela.
Yes.
Yes.
Perfect. Okay. Yeah, mutations. Actually, why is this starting here? I'm going backwards. Sorry about that. So, mutations currently on display and in fact extended to the end of January. So, if you still have the chance to see it until the 29th of January, stop by in Frankfurt. This is us entering the building into the foyer. The Villa 102 is not a neutral art space with white exhibition walls, but a former family home, an architectural landmark, a Jewish memorial space or a memorial site for Jewish living in Frankfurt. Then, it was the literature house in the 90s. It was the moment when it transitioned from a private home into a public space. There's a broad history that you can read up online. I won't go into too much detail. We see the work of Maxwell Mutanda here, architect from Zimbabwe, currently based in London, and his work Deliverance is a spatial intervention on post or neo-colonial urban planning on the African continent. Maxwell, kindly wave to our audience. I won't have time to go into detail for each project, obviously, but we will share a PDF later on with some short label texts on the work, so you have a chance to go more into depth. I've turned right, entering the foyer, I've turned right into the first room to the work of Korean media artist Sabina Ho-Yuan, who presents a sound installation based on the research with scientists of biophysics on the transition of parasital diseases. And the room right next to hers, the so-called Herrensalon in the Villa 102, shows an installation by Brazilian philosopher Joana Quiroga, who installed the table exploring historical roots of ongoing hierarchies in access to food. Joana is here today, at the moment apparently in Argentina. Kindly wave to our audience. Beautiful. We're moving into the next room. I'm taking you on a loop, so to say, and we're looking at the three-channel film installation by Colombian anthropologist Ana Maria Gomez Lopez, who is based in the Netherlands at the moment and looks at the history of science, the Western canon of knowledge, and respectively the capital of knowledge that comes with it. Ana Maria is also here. Warm welcome and kindly wave. Thank you. We are now looking at the three-channel film installation of Paris-based filmmaker Clara Joe, who explores the disturbed relationship between human and non-human living on the planet and the imbalance of that cohabitance at the moment. And taking a step further back, we're basically walking backwards on this. We're looking on the right, we see the screen with the computer live generated performance by Grayson Earl. Welcome, Grayson, he's here as well. Grayson is a media artist and hacktivist, one may say, and programs a software to subvert the misuse of that digital data tracking with this installation here that looks like a video at first sight, but is a computer-generated live performance. This is the front view. And now we are turning around and looking into the last room, to the work of filmmaker Angela Anderson, who looks at fracking and resource extraction in North Dakota and addresses the consequences for ecological and social systems. And this is us leaving the room again. So this was a very quick walk through the exhibition space, and you can see there's a lot of media works, film works involved. As I said before, all projects either collaborate with science or scientific methods. They comment on them, they observe them, they translate them, and find their own aesthetic expression in this. And with this, I'm going to leave my introduction at this point. We are all here to hear the keynote by Dr. Brigitte Franzen. And may I quickly introduce you to those who don't know your work yet. Dr. Franzen is an art historian and cultural scientist with a focus on museum and exhibition history, and as well as landscape theory. Since 2021, she is the director of the Senckenberg Museum here in Frankfurt, which is right around the corner from KfW Stiftung. We're basically neighbors, which is lovely, and it's really great to have you here for the talk today. Before that, Brigitte Franzen was chairwoman and CEO of the Peter and Irene Ludwig Foundation, which is affiliated with 28 museums and institutions of fine art and archaeology worldwide. And she headed the Ludwig Forum for International Arts in Aachen. Before that, curated major international exhibitions, among many, for example, the sculpture project Münster in 2007. But she's also founded several archives, which is also very interesting when we look at the interplay of arts and science and transdisciplinary approaches. At the Senckenberg, she's also responsible for the archive of the Senckenberg Research Institute and Natural History Museum. Brigitte Franzen describes her approach as a research-based curating, and I think with this, I'm going to now mute my microphone and pass on over to you. A very warm welcome, and the floor is yours.
To give you a short introduction to what I'm doing today and my practice and relation to artistic research, I want to summarize a little bit the work of the last years. For me, actually, doing art and also reflecting art and curating art is always related to research in a very broad sense, of course. If you look at the history of artistic research that you know as well as I do, of course, there are many routes to mention, more recent ones like Hans Hake's practice, for example, in the 60s, or anthropologically related art practices like the one of Nancy Graves, for example, or Nikolaus Lang, a German artist, also in the 60s and 70s. But you can even go further, and this is something I want to show you later on in my talk, in my little talk. If you look at, for example, the relation of art and science in the 17th century, as for example with Maria Sibylle Merian, where we prepare an exhibition for the next year. In my biography, as Daniela already mentioned, I just recently changed from the, let's say, art-driven field to the more science or nature-driven field. And this was, of course, by purpose, because for me, it was really a great challenge to get the opportunity to lead this wonderful museum in Frankfurt, which has the name Senckenberg Naturmuseum, Nature Museum, which in my opinion triggers a certain relationship between the natural sciences and the cultural field, to put it as broadly as possible, not to mention art itself, summarizing it under the topic of the cultural field. This Nature Museum and Research Institute was founded in 1817, and the museum opened its doors in 1821 already. So it's one of the oldest nature museums, natural history museums in the world. Many of them were founded later, like after the 1860s, 1890s. So Frankfurt really was one of the pioneers in this field. And interestingly enough, it was explicitly called by German poet Goethe, Johann Wolfgang von Goethe, a nature museum. So this sounds a bit old-fashioned when I'm mentioning it, but I think it's an important point and also a trigger for the work we do now and today to reflect the special relationship of nature and museum, not only defining ourselves as a natural history museum or ein Naturkunde museum, as it is called in Germany often, a museum on the knowledge of nature. One could translate this. So we define each other as a nature museum, and this for me was one of the most important aspects of joining Senckenberg and becoming one leading figure there at Senckenberg and in the Nature Museum. Senckenberg as a whole, one should probably explain also very quickly, is a research body, a research institution. The collections are the 5th largest in the world, and they go from geology, from like the oldest finds, 3.6 billion years old, from like the beginning of the Earth, up to very recent findings and studies around birds, for example, bird relations to man, movements of animals, and also DNA studies from paleontology to recent living world. So we are mainly a very, very large research institution. And one part of this is the Nature Museum. And of course, it was a big shift for me to come from the art field and the practice of art curating to this research body and to this special situation at the Nature Museum, where the differences mainly are that probably, to put it quite roughly, in the art field, you do exhibitions much more, maybe in a much more experimental way, maybe also much faster, maybe let's say more fluid in a certain sense than the usual practice of the Natural History Museum is. The usual practice of a natural history museum is that you're building in large exhibitions on certain research topics, which will last, let's say, 10 to 20 years. And the researchers that are working with us, they are not all exhibition curators. We have a certain special team of exhibition curators who are trained biologists, geologists, paleontologists. And then we have curators of collections, which is not the same. That's also very different from the art museum. That in the art museum, you usually have curators as bearers of a collection, as well as curators of exhibitions. In the Natural History Museum, that's more differentiated, and it's more distanced as a practice from each other. So it could happen in former years that a scientist maybe once in a lifetime was doing an exhibition. This is a practice, of course, which is completely different from other museum fields. And it's also a practice I would love to change radically, because I think our mission and our task as a museum also is to be faster in including new knowledge and new ideas in the representation and in the exhibitions we are doing in a nature museum, because this field of knowledge is changing so fast and so in so many directions that the museum is a perfect platform for negotiating all those issues and all those fields and aspects of our natural sciences, as well as our nature perception. So the direction we want to develop the museum is very much into, of course, an area of knowledge, but also a field of discussion and a place of meeting, of course, of very different fields of society and very different people representing different areas of society. And the good thing actually is, in the Natural History Museum or the Nature Museum, we didn't suffer so much the so-called Corona gap. We could immediately link to our practice of before Corona, and also to our amounts of visitors. And there is a very large positive response by society as a whole, by the general public as a whole, towards our subjects and our contents that differs very much from the recent experiences of the art museums, because of course they are much more exclusive in many directions as we are, and this is something we experience every day. We have at the Senckenberg Naturmuseum around 450,000 visitors a day, not a day, sorry, a year. A day would be not bearable. And we have like between 30 and 50,000 people a month. So we gain an attention which is absolutely interesting also for scientists to deliver their knowledge through the format of an exhibition or through other formats of representation, visualization, let's call it. What we are changing at the moment, and where artistic research very much comes into play, is that we started, since I'm there, in asking artists to not just bring in their practice, their knowledge, their works, but asking them to design, to conceptualize our representations, our exhibitions, our subjects. And so this is a way we are going to develop further. We are just in the making of a large exhibition on brain and brains of animals, and also the human brain, which will be conceived and visualized by Tim Beresheim, a digital artist from Germany who is working very much in the field of artificial reality and augmented reality. And I would have loved to show you some pictures also of his design. So maybe I can give it later into the round to give you at least an insight into this, into those ideas. Or we asked, for example, a Frankfurt-based artist and architecture group called Yardworks to design 2 of our exhibitions. One was a large excavation site which we erected outside the museum. This is also something we are following to under the idea of outreach, to use other places than the museum itself to deliver our contents. And they also designed our very newly opened artistic and scientific workshop called AHA Research Lab. And this is another very good example for a new practice we are introducing in at least our museum, to ask for the visual expertise of artists who are related with artistic research to deliver and to work together with us on the design of the exhibitions. And when I call it design, then hopefully you understand it as not just the design. Design for me is something which is really an intrinsic part of the exhibition. It's not just something which is added. Without the form and the format of an exhibition, and it very carefully designed surrounding, you would not really be able to bring over the message, to really educate and deliver contents to the people. So this is a very important issue for me and for us to develop here a very new practice for our house, which is also kind of new, at least in the field of the natural history museums. how do we follow this path, and how do we develop this in detail? When I came to the museum, I found a space which had no place for time-based projects of, let's say, 8 weeks, 12 weeks, or something like this. There was not one possibility for a temporary exhibition because there was simply no room for it. So the first thing I was conceiving, trying to find out which areas of the museum we could get rid of, so to speak, to empty them and to develop a free space. And this free space is now consisting of one area which has 150 square meters, and then 2 to 3 other areas which can be opened up, filled in with new projects, and then opened up again. So during the last 2 years, we gained a new space, so to speak, for about 300 square meters, which can be used very vividly and faster in introducing different types of subjects and exhibitions. And for example, next year we will do a project with artist Maria Loboda, on the Eocene, the era of the world 50 million years ago, where near Frankfurt, this very interesting excavation pit, Messel, plays a very important role. Also in the research of Senckenberg Institute, this plays a very important role. And Maria took up this subject, becoming very much interested in the Messel pit and in subjects around the development of mammals. And she is now currently doing a film around this. And we will present this film as one exhibition next year in one of those free spaces we created. Another aspect to bring in art, like the third aspect maybe to mention in our nature museum, is of course the cooperation with other museums. And we will do this in a large scale in 2024 with the Literature Museum, Romantic Museum here in Frankfurt, around the topic of the forests. New narratives on the forests, the exhibition will be called, and of course artworks will be included, and there will be 3 institutions joining the Romantic Museum, the Naturmuseum Senckenberg, and a smaller museum in Bad Homburg, Sinclair House. And another cooperation, as an example, will be next year, where we are joining forces with Schirn in their project called A Plastic Age, and we will show one large installation by the Turkish artist Yoldaş, Pina Yoldaş, around the topic of the oceans and the plastic in the oceans. So those are like the 3 approaches where art, artistic research, natural sciences come into interplay in such a special museum as the Senckenberg Naturmuseum is. And maybe let me now show you some pictures of the other exhibition we are preparing for next year, called Floralia, which shows 3 different women artists who were occupied with the relationship of art and science, if you want to call it like this, in the 18th, 19th, and 20th century. And this is Maria Sibylle Merian, that you see here, Elisabeth Schulz, and Ulrike Crespo. And this exhibition also will take place in one of those free spaces that the visitors who join us in the museum have the possibility really to wander around the museum and get the chance to see very different, very unusual things also in the nature museums, excuse me if I call it like this, objects that they would maybe not expect there. And with the shift in experience and in perception, I have the hope to gain a different and maybe a more intense interest also than just in an art museum. Maria Sibylle Merian, you know her probably, was a designer and a person, an artist who draw and painted wonderful drawings on plants and animals. And she was very much engaged in really doing very realistic surveys on insects, and realistic in the way that her approach was really to arrange and build up experimental situations where she could really research on the development of insects. And after she was starting this as a young person already, when she was 13 or 14, she asked herself after some time what kind of product would come out of this research. She did it not as a trained, let's say, biologist. She did it as a person who was, let's say, on the brink of the development of biology as a research field, if you want, or on the brink of the development of academically organized research in universities, in the natural histories. So she invented, as somebody who came out of a family of printers, including her research and her artistic expression in the formats of books. And so she developed this wonderful book on jetzt habe ich den Namen vergessen, Frau Field, Schmetterlinge und Raupen. Could you just help me with the translation?
Sorry, butterflies and caterpillars?
Sorry?
Butterflies and caterpillars?
Yes, thanks a lot. Thanks so much. So her research on butterflies was then the base for this wonderful book. Maybe you can make the next slide, please. Or can I do it by my own? No, yeah. And what you see here are beautifully pictures of flowers she developed together with the development of butterflies, from the very small little animals, little puppets, to the developed butterfly animal, at least. Could you go further, please, Rose? Interestingly enough, is that she added to the pictures a very broad description on the flowers, and inside those texts, it's not at all about the flowers itself. It always describes the animal behind it, and what makes her so important for today is that she describes the interrelation of the flower or the plant and the animals. So she's said to be like one of the first persons who researched the idea of biodiversity, interrelation of species, of flowers, of plants and animals. Could you go further, please? Elisabeth Schulz, as a next very interesting artist, is somebody who was a trained painter also, but as well as Maria Sibylle Merian, she didn't get the chance to join an art school because they were simply not open for women artists at that time. And Elisabeth trained herself privately, and then later joined also as a private teacher different private art schools. And she was the teacher and trainer of many of Frankfurt's well-known families of the 19th century. Especially also the women of those families got their artistic training at Elisabeth Schulz's lessons. And in the 30s of the 19th century, she developed the idea to collect the flora of Frankfurt as completely as possible in that time. So she developed an herbarium, but not with collected plants. She in reality collected, but only with drawn and painted plants and flowers. And shortly before her death, in the 90s of the 19th century, she bequested this body of work of more than 1,200 sheets to Senckenberg. And asked just to make it be exhibited the one or the other day, as it is called. So, interestingly enough, the works were only exhibited, I think, within the last 100 years or 130 years, I think once or twice. So this will be like the first time we take out this body of work and show it to the general public. And maybe the next slide, please. The interesting thing about it is that you can relate her herbarium to other herbarias that we obtain at Senckenberg of the real plants. And the next slide, please. We can show also the extinction of some of the plants, or the danger, the danger under which they live today. So we have a whole history of plants behind this body of artworks. Next slide, please. The gouaches are of the size of, let's say, 40 to 30 centimeters, and they're really beautifully made, added with some added descriptions and little remarks, some by the hand of Elisabeth Schulz, others by botanists of Senckenberg, which were added later. And you can also see how influential and necessary, in a certain sense, those depictions were for research also. And this is an interesting aspect of this exhibition, where we won't just show beautiful plant depictions in a natural history realm, but we want to show the interdependence of the way of visualizing species and the natural world in relation to the scientific approaches around it. Next slide, please. And it's not decided yet, but I think we are going to relate also the artworks, if you want to put it like this, and the herbarium species, which are not, of course, collected by Elisabeth Schulz, but which are so much related to her depictions, to give an insight also in the study of plants and in the visualization of research. This is something which interests me a lot, because it's in the Nature Museum, it's not only about, of course, research alone or artistic research, it's also about the visuality of natural sciences, which is a really interesting own field, which triggers, of course, also your work the one or the other way. Next slide, please. This is another example of beautiful orchid-like little plant. Next slide, please. While Maria Sibylle Merian and Elisabeth Schulz had their own, let's say, difficulties in developing their artistic practice and somehow choose the scientific field as a field of expression also, where they were allowed to practice their art practice, to realize their art practice. Of course, the 20th century is much more open, or gets more and more open for female artists to join art schools, to develop their own practice. And because all the before mentioned artists have a certain relation to Frankfurt, I chose a third artist also related very much to Frankfurt, Ulrike Crespo, who has an own very special biography and relation to the art field. She is first and foremost, she was first and foremost a psychologist and also an art collector. She obtained in the 90s a large area in Ireland at the Roaring Water Bay, where she followed her own artistic research, let's say, in the field of photography. She documented the plans on this piece of land where she also lived partly, and then printed them out in a very everyday kind of printer, not an art printer, not a photography printer, and brought them back to nature and let them just lie in the rain. And she developed a very beautiful series called the so-called rain flowers, which brings back some, somehow poetic issues into this special exhibition around the idea of the relation of art and research. Maybe the next slide. She introduced nature as her partner in developing her artworks. And she unfortunately never really showed those works. So this will be the first time then next year to show her works to a general public, because she somehow did the, and this is somehow irony of history also, she did her artistic practice more hidden in a more private area, because she was so well known as a collector and as a supporter in the art field. She wouldn't want to mix this practice too much. Therefore, her photos aren't really known, and this is a chance for us now to show them. But one thing links all those three persons through history, that they all used the book, or at least the atlas, as an idea of not only collecting their artworks, but also presenting them. Ulrike Crespo never showed the works in an exhibition, but she published books about it. And there she's linked also to the practice of Maria Sibylle Merian, of course. Next slide, please. Another series of photos of Ulrike Crespo, which interests me at the moment very much. And it's not yet decided if we mix photographs of both series, or if we decide maybe to concentrate on one area, is that she researched the liminal field of underwater and on the shore, just this area between water and shore, and researched the plants there that are growing in the sea but are related to the earth, so to speak. And this is as a conclusion, those are two photos that I want to show you. Next, please. from this series, which I find really, really interesting. Also, meanwhile, only published in a book, but never really shown in an exhibition. Yeah, maybe this is it. Just some ideas on the relationship of artistic research, exhibiting artistic research, my current practice in how to do it in a natural history museum, in a Naturmuseum, nature museum, in difference to the practice maybe of exhibition making in an art museum. Thank you so much for listening, and I'm looking very much forward to discussing.
Thank you so much, Brigitte Franzen, for this great input keynote. I think well, for me personally, it triggered a lot, but before I would like to look into the round of the Mutationist fellows and see if there is some initial reactions to the just presented interplay between forms and formatting and ways of presentation between art and science, especially with those last three. Elke would like to start. Sure, Elke.
Yeah,
Go
maybe
ahead.
a very short remark. I really would like to deeply thank you, Brigitte Franzen, for this wonderful insight of your curatorial approach in directing the museum in a completely new way, in a new direction. And I'm pretty much looking forward for my first visit to Senckenberg and give the art such a big stage for this. And I'm pretty much looking forward for sure for the three artists. That's really, really interesting. Also the overview over the last 3 centuries. I would like to make only a note that Pina Yoldes was part of our jury.
I heard
yes,
of it.
Brigitte Franzen and I already talked about that. Yes,
yeah.
So Pina Yoldes was one of the selecting members of the jury, which chose the 7 fellows who participated in the Mutations program. So that's a nice coincidence there.
Coincidence, yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, thank you. Thank
okay.
you.
So any questions? Maria, Anna Maria, I see your hand is up. So perhaps you would like to start with a question.
Yeah, really fantastic presentation, very exciting direction, and really, equally like Elke, I look forward to being able to experience some of these exhibitions in person. I think it's very interesting for having this direction for the museum, particularly in light of previous scientists that have moved through some of these spaces and had very, let's say, kind of expansive ways of interpreting exhibitions. I'm thinking of Willem Schaefer specifically, and kind of being able to revive that history of scientists being able to visualize sort of visualization, to borrow your own term of a scientific practice, but also really thinking of it both inwardly for the discipline and exteriorly for the broader public. I highlight him as a paleontologist because in my own research, both for the Mutations Fellowship, but also more generally, I am very interested in German paleontology of the early 20th century, and particularly him, Rudolf Richter, Johannes Weigelt, paleontologists who set up museums themselves to try to make visual some of the work that would be sort of difficult to be able to explain in a short form scientific paper or even in a scientific monograph that really required sort of that experiential dimension. And I was curious, particularly with regards to the Messelpit. This is now my own curiosity, which will be satisfied, I guess, in years to come. But you mentioned the excavation site in terms of Yard's work, correct? And then the film, which is, I guess, interacting or relating to this long-standing excavation site. And I'm more curious to hear in terms of archaeology, paleontology, and anthropology, my home discipline, what's in store.
Yeah.
If you wouldn't mind elaborating.
Yeah, it's a bit of misunderstanding I think I produced, because the excavation site of Yardworks was not around Messe. It was around dinosaurs, and they brought curators brought a larger piece of land, so to speak. Sounds crazy, but it was like this: some tons heavy piece of land to Frankfurt, and Yardworks built a house around it, and we excavated on site Edmontosaurus mainly bones, and are going to continue with this inside the house next year and the year after. But this was not related to Messe. The Messe exhibition will be made new around the Jubilee in 2025, because the Messe research at Senckenberg started 75, and the pit became World Heritage in 1995. So we have several jubilees then, and we are just starting in developing ideas for a new Messel exhibition then, which will probably be housed, if you know the site. I just heard while you were mentioning Wilhelm Schäfer and others, which will be housed when you come into the museum left-hand side in the beside the first hall. And Maria Loboda, by herself, had this idea of concentrating on Messel, especially on the wells there, because there is this humidity problem. There was a large lake there. That's very important also for the fossilization of the animals there. But today they have to avoid water, so they build a big pumping and well controlling system there, so to speak. And Maria will focus on this. It will be a very beautiful film, very how do you call it? Full of fantasy, animals, and around the topic of the well. So we will see how this develops. But yeah, as you mentioned before, there is a certain tradition at Senckenberg in the visualization of research in general, and it was neglected, I think, after Wilhelm Schäfer left the house in the 80s, probably because all his successors were mainly academically trained natural scientists. So they were not even museum specialists. They mainly came from the universities and had, of course, a very big research interest and scientific interest. And sometimes I have the impression they just were satisfied, in conceiving a museum, which was nice by itself, but not asking themselves to conceive the museum at the same level of maybe avant-garde approach than their scientific thinking was. They were satisfied with a much, let's say, easier role of the museum. And this is something, of course, we want to change now, because this is not any longer suitable in this changing world, in this kind of changing society we are living in. You cannot just leave a museum by itself and do not really substantial changes in it without questioning your own practice also. Maybe this is something which also is related in our practice, in the curatorial practice, to the artistic research practice. Of course, it has to be a constant questioning. We are also some kind of an agency for questions, much more than an agency for results.
I'll just say quickly, it was a lovely answer. And yes, indeed, the sort of the positing of questions does seem to be the fuel, as it were, for being able to allow the audience to even carry out the work of of being able to put themselves in the position of seeing how science, art, and all the process of the making of what they see in the exhibition kind of comes to the fore through multiple angles, not one just simply of academic expertise. And yes, I had understood the excavation site being separate from the missile site, but I applaud the taking on the difficulty of showing the formation of an artifact and a site as, I think, a common thread, but really quite exciting and looking forward to seeing it.
Yeah, for me, it is related very much also to a certain honesty. You know, we are asked for also by society, and yeah, somehow an ethical approach also to questioning what we are doing. How do we show? What do we show? How do we know what we show? How relational is it? But also then, of course, based on facts. This is what we stand for. It's also a place for fact checking, of course. Yeah, much more than in the art museum. Maybe.
Thank you both. Are there further questions? Otherwise, I would follow up on the just being said. Joanna, yes, please.
I think, sorry, thank you very much for your presentation, sharing about your work. And related to what you have presented and the comments you just did right now about the question of Ana Maria's, I'd like to ask, the Nature Museum probably has all the types of audiences. So I'd like to question about having in mind this research and the next exhibition you're planning. What I would like to hear more about the strategies you're creating or thinking about reaching some of those audiences, like school kids or like or probably international audience like Frankfurt has. And also, since you mentioned this in your last question about the problematic situation of a museum and a collection that has items from all around the world. And if you have, like when you plan the exhibition, if you target parallel to the exhibition itself, some of these discussions on the exhibition, bringing them somehow.
That's a very interesting body of questions, actually, yeah, group of questions. Yeah, first maybe how do we approach the audience, and how about target groups and things like this? Actually, as you mentioned, we reach such a large and different group of people that we have the challenge to be as understandable as possible on the one hand, not neglecting the specificity of certain questions and research fields also. And then also, of course, including what you just mentioned, international museum questions, so to speak, questions which are on the table in terms of provenance studies, for example, and all this area, this field. So how do we do this? We try to do it on several levels at the same time. Let's put it like this, because we are, as a big museum, we have such a broad audience that it's just difficult to, or that's completely different from a smaller institution where you can be maybe more detailed, maybe even more special in a certain sense. We have to have a certain broad subjects, of fields of presentation, what we're doing. But this is not excluding being special, being exclusive sometimes even with certain subjects and certain fields of knowledge. The question always is, how do you do this best? What's the main kind of, or what is the group of possibilities you have? What comes into play then, of course, is media. There's always this very large field of object and space relation in the museum, which is a very real kind of field. And then you have to ask yourself, what is the media of how do you call it? What in which medias you can deliver more special informations, maybe, and how do you approach then special interest groups also? And we do this on very different levels. We do it for disabled people, for example. We have a certain we have a special way of approaching blind people, for example. We have still a lack in showing better provenance issues. This is done, or this is prepared at the moment, and it's done very simply. First by naming and giving more information simply. Especially at the different objects. For example, if you have the Diplodocus dinosaur, for example, it has to be shown more detailed. Where are the bones coming from? Who digged them out? Who discovered them? How did they come to Frankfurt? All those issues. This has to be done much more carefully as it was done before, and we are just starting with this. This also has the necessity to study the own collection much deeper than it was done before. This is also something where I was kind of surprised when I came there, because of course we have digitized collection management, but the informations included there are merely, let's say, useful for natural science purposes. They are not so useful for historical purposes, for example. It's not so useful for the study of the history of the collection so far. And this is also kind of a neglected field a little bit. I mean, it was always in the hands of the interests of certain researchers, if they do it in their collections or they don't. But it was not really a necessity so far, a defined necessity to do this. So we just started it and are going to change now the labels, adding more information, but also there it's a question of media. How much do you present analogous in reality, so to speak? How much can you shift to for example, the media guide? What do you do with the personal education, with guides and guided tours? How can you include this into this new way of bringing in more information and also explaining the history of the institution and all this? So I really cannot, as you see, I cannot really answer it just by one method or by mentioning one way of doing it. I think it's more a matter of mentality, to be aware of all this and then to find the right solution for each project you do, whether it's a permanent exhibition, whether it's a special exhibition or an artist project or another kind of project. It always has to be specific. but the mentality is so important. And this is a process. It's a process which includes the whole museum team, the whole also research team at Senckenberg, to start to reflect and not to understand it as a black and white issue or a left and right issue or something like this. It's a political issue, of course, but it's not about party politics. It's an issue of ethics and of mankind in general. So it's a process, and we are beginning it at the moment. We're starting it.
Thank you. Joanna's nodding. I don't think she wants to. No, okay. Any other questions? Joanna, you're talking, but you are not.
I just said a little thank you. Thank you.
Okay. Yeah. I would like to maybe follow up on what's just been said. I think it's really interesting to think of the museum as a platform for knowledge transfer on different levels and scales. There's the sort of general perception, the audiences, the people coming in to visit, but there's also this intersection between, I think in the beginning you were talking about it, when you bring together curators for natural history collections and artists, for example. And I was wondering if you could elaborate a little bit more on the processes of collaboration that maybe already take place or that are being discussed, because I guess the process is part of the process, so to say. For example, if we stick to the brain example, who suggests the topics or how are the focal points worked out between the disciplines, so to say? How do the individual practices inform each other? Can you maybe just elaborate a little bit about this moment of creating new knowledge platforms before they even take that step outside and the audience comes in?
Yeah, that's really interesting. Of course, we are influenced by different ideas and wishes, also sometimes by the researchers, the scientists, but also our own tasks. For example, one good example is one project we just started. It's called Temporary Permanence, and the task is to develop a tool, a display, together with an artist who makes it possible that a permanent exhibition, no matter firsthand which subject, can be actualized. This is something which the museum team by itself developed, and we asked for funding and we are very happy because we got a substantial funding by the Ministry of Science, by the Federal Ministry of Science for this, because it is an issue in many museums. How do you actualize permanent exhibitions, and how do you do this in a way which is interesting, which is visually good, and which really provides a service, if you want. So we researched for an artist to ask to develop this display, and we found Markus Zimmermann, who's anyway somebody who's working very much in groups. He was also part of one of the projects of recent Documenta in Kassel. He's a trained carpenter also. So it took us a longer time to find him and to also find out which person we would need to develop something like this together with us. And then it's always a work in groups. It's a work which is organized by two museum curators. And what's very important to me at the moment is that we try to link always knowledge fields. So I'm absolutely happy when I have, let's say, an anthropologist joining a geologist, and they work together in doing such an exhibition. And this is the fact also for this exhibition, that we have cultural scientists working together with biologists in doing this exhibition around the topic of the reefs. So we chose a newer permanent exhibition we just erected 2 years ago, but with a field which is so important at the moment, which is received by the general public very broadly: the reefs. How can we protect the reefs? What do we do for the reefs? Because it's such a biodiversity hub for all of us. We invited Markus Zimmermann, as I said, and we developed the content and also the tool, the furniture, the display together with him. And we just opened the first part of this exhibition. And this is something which is interesting also for us as an experiment. And I like it very much as an approach. We opened it before the exhibition is ready, so to speak. We opened like the first phase and show already this display furniture, filled it also with content and with many interesting aspects and subjects. And then we will have 2 more phases within the project, and the project only ends mid-2024. So we have 1.5 years now ahead in developing this together also with the public, together with our youth council, who are included from the beginning on in this whole making. And for me, this is kind of an ideal type of exhibition making, at least around this topic of how do we temporary actualize permanent installations. This is one example, one good example I find of our practice. And I think this is, for me, it's very much, this is something, or a direction, better to say, where museums are asked for at the moment. It's not any longer this place where, the static kind of place where high culture is represented. It is a much more fluid place, and this is really good. I mean, it's a much more, can be a much more experimental place. It's a place where the general public trusts still. We are a trusted institution, which is kind of rare in our contemporary world, and this is an asset we have. And therefore we can much more, let's say, play with it also in an experimental and a creative kind of way.
Thank you. Yeah, I recall you said in the beginning, we need to become faster. I wrote that down.
Yeah,
I think it's
true.
true.
Faster and slower, maybe both, you know.
Yeah, maybe both.
Most important thing is just not stand still and just see the waves around you.
Are there further questions? Also, a warm welcome to our audience to ask a question if you like. Otherwise, I'll also look into this group. Elke, and then Anna Maria after that.
Yeah, I only would like to congratulate Brigitte Franzen. It's wonderful because you started with a quite important sentence. You said imagination is a tool for artistic research. And what I got now, what I received, is that you also understand the museum as a, you brought up the sentence, an agency for questions, not for answers. And so I see that Senckenberg Museum, or museums in general, can really be a place for this imagination, right? And this is what I got from from you, from your presentation, from your new conceptual ideas for the museum. It's so crucial. Thank you.
Thank you,
Yeah,
Elke.
thank you. It's a way we are. It's a path. It's a journey we are on. You know.
Yes, we are on all together.
Yeah.
And then maybe we're heading towards our last question already. Anna Maria, you had your hands up before, your virtual hand up.
Yeah, I wouldn't want to just be the last question, but it was in light of a shy audience. I am curious, following up on your answer to Joanna's question with regards to sort of this overlooked area of research within museums to actually look at the history of their own artifacts, not just simply in questions of provenance, but let's say kind of all the steps that are linking that item to the collection and later to its display. And you said you're starting to work on this. What areas of the museum have you prioritized, or what parts of the collection are getting that first range of attention, just out of curiosity?
It's an interesting question. It has several directions. One is to highlight the highlight objects, because those are the ones who are mostly perceived and seen by the people. And then, of course, it's also a strategic question. We are preparing, for example, a project which is called Secret Service, quotation mark, on the women of Senckenberg. And this will be one, let's say, walkway through all different parts of the exhibition we have to show the work of the women there. That's another strategy, so to speak. And then we will be very practical. Always when we change something, we will also change, of course, the labels. And so we will move, this is maybe the slowest part, move from parts to parts, because it's difficult then to choose or to prioritize, let's say, the mammals towards the insects or so. So we are going very practically forward. Every time when we change something, we keep attention of changing all of this, and yeah, being more clear there.
Well, fascinating, and yeah, moving through the highlights and the female presence of the museum is a fantastic way to start for the mutation of one's own collection.
Yeah, but it also takes time. It might sound so, I don't know, yeah, it's very vivid, but it also takes time, of course, to realize it, especially, for example, this women project. We had to raise money for it, and we had some problems in raising money. And hopefully we can realize it in 2024, 25, something like this. Yeah. So this is also the reality, that you cannot really realize all at once. You really have to be patient too in the museum.
Thank you. Thank you, Brigitte Franzen, for your time, for sharing your approaches to the Senckenberg Museum with us, some input and ideas on what artistic research can be and how exhibiting it can also mean to publish a book. So I think we will keep thinking about these different formats and ways. I would like to repeat the invitation to the audience to visit the exhibition at Villa 102 in Bockenheim in Frankfurt, and maybe on your way there or on the way back, stop by the Senckenberg Museum to sort of follow up on your thoughts, hopefully triggered by the input provided. Thank you, Brigitte Franzen. I would also like to thank the artists who were able to join us today, Anna Maria, Joanna, Maxwell, Grayson. Thank you to Alisa and Rose, who are making sure everything is running smoothly and making all this happen. And of course, thank you, Elke, for joining us and for ending this. This will be our last open public activity for this year. So I'm glad to finish the year with this and yeah, have a warm and positive festive season and transition into the new year, everyone. And thank you for joining us today.
Thanks so much also. Please come over to Frankfurt, visit the museum.